Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar put on by the Gateway to Global Aging Data. Before we get started, and while we're waiting for more people to join, if this is your first time using GoToWebinar, I'd like to familiarize you a little bit with the process. First of all, congratulations on logging in and hopefully being able to hear me and currently see my screen. This webinar today is meant to be participatory, so we would like you to ask questions if you have any questions throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar. And you can interact with myself or ask any questions using the questions panel. So you can just pose a question in there, and I'll try to keep an eye on that throughout the webinar to be able to answer those. For some of those, I also might wait until the end to address them depending on how we're running on time. There's also a chat functionality, so you can place something in chat there. And I will mention that the slides and a recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website, the Gateway to Global Aging Data, shortly within 24 hours after today's webinar. All right, so I think that we can go ahead and get started then. Again, thank you for joining. My name is Dristan Phillips. I'm a research programmer and part of the Gateway to Global Aging team here at the University of Southern California. In today's webinar, we're considering an advanced webinar, which means that you probably are somewhat familiar with the International Family of Health and Retirement Studies. And perhaps you've used some harmonized data that's produced by the Gateway to Global Aging Data, or you visited our website. If you're not as familiar with those things, stay tuned. I'll explain them as we go along also. So I think often to get started using any data, sometimes it's best to just propose a research question and answer it using the data. So that's what we're going to do today in this advanced webinar. We're going to walk through kind of a two-part, very simple analysis. This analysis is going to be using the Harmonized SHARE data. And I'll explain a little bit what harmonized data means. SHARE is, of course, the Survey on Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe. It's a multi-country survey that's been going on since 2014. And we're also going to be using Harmonized SHARE End of Life data. This is a newer data product that we've developed here. And end of life data, and I'll talk a little bit about it more, but it's data that's compiled from a next of kin or an exit interview that's performed after the longitudinal respondent who's part of that survey has passed away. So you can find out some really important information about what was the time like between that person's last interview and the end of their life, and what were the circumstances of the end of their life. So let me first introduce harmonized data if you're not familiar. So harmonized data sets are produced by the Gateway to Global Aging Data, and they're created to provide comparable and research-ready variables. So what that means is that harmonized data sets contain a subset of the original survey variables. So it certainly doesn't have everything that's, for instance, the harmonized SHARE does not have everything, every variable that's contained in SHARE. We really try to focus on those variables which are most frequently used by researchers and are most comparable across the international family of health and retirement surveys, those SHARE sister surveys. So variables are defined as similarly as possible across all harmonized data sets. Each data set is a FAT file, so all the waves are combined into one data set, and each individual is one record. Harmonized datasets use an intuitive variable naming convention. So for instance, a variable named R1 work is whether the respondent, that's the R, is working work at wave 1. And again, you can kind of see using this kind of intuitive variable naming convention how we can have multiple waves of data inside of the same data set. We also use study-specific variable names. Of course, not all survey measures are comparable across all harmonized surveys, and so in that case, we don't give them exactly the same variable name. So for instance, a variable named R1, and this is LBRF, or labor force status here, and we have an underscore S, and what that lets you know is that if you're using this variable in the harmonized share, that underscore S says this variable is specific to the harmonized share. There's something different about this variable than the LBRF variable, that labor force variable in the harmonized HRS in the data from the US, or the harmonized ELSA, which is the data from England. Harmonized datasets also contain spouse versions of most variables, so we've done spouse matching, and we include spouse variables. For instance, a variable like S2 work would tell you in the observation of that respondent whether their spouse at wave 2 is working at wave 2. Our variables are considered research ready, and that means that they have been built to account for any survey skip pattern, and each data set is accompanied by a harmonized codebook. Harmonized data sets can be downloaded or created from the Gateway to Global Aging data. And let's go quickly to the Gateway to Global Aging data. So our website is g2aging.org. If you click here on our Surveys at a Glance tab, you can see a lot of the surveys that we consider to be sister surveys. These are comparable longitudinal health and retirement surveys that are conducted around the world. And you can see here in this last row the harmonized data sets that we produce for these different surveys. To get access to the original survey data or the harmonized data, you can click on our Downloads tab there at the top. And you can see here links to download the harmonized data set. You can also see links to download the harmonized codebook, those codebooks that I mentioned, and links to create harmonized data if you would like this data creation code, or, as is the case of harmonized share, if we're going to actually create the harmonized share using some Stata code that we provide for you, the user. To be a user of the Gateway, you just need to register. You can register in the top right here. If I logged out, I could click in and register. Registration is free. All of our harmonized data sets are publicly provided for anyone doing research across the world. They are de-identified data sets for secondary analysis in particular, and they're all provided without any cost to the researcher. And let's also talk about that newer data product that I mentioned, this Harmonized End of Life data. So harmonized end of life data sets are very similar to what we talked about before in harmonized data sets, but these are specifically created to provide easily merged and comparable research ready variables for end of life data. So variables are going to be defined as similarly as possible to the harmonized share. So if there are questions that are asked, as we'll see in our example today, that are asked to the respondent throughout their lifetime, that same question might also be asked to the respondent, the proxy, who's responding about them in their end-of-life interview. So we try to name those variables similarly. We use the same intuitive variable naming convention as we talked about in the regular harmonized data. The data sets combine all waves together, and each individual is one record. And all variables are panel level. And what we mean by that is that an exit interview is basically conducted, for most surveys, it's conducted every single wave. So if they come back to a house and they'd say, 2 years ago or at our last wave, we interviewed John Smith, we'd like to interview him again. If John Smith has deceased, they'll then conduct an interview with the next of kin or someone who's well informed to answer questions about their end of life. So all of those different waves that happen also for the end of life data are put into one data set. Harmonized end of life data also use country-specific variable names. So for instance, a variable called RACOD_share is whether the disease that caused the respondent's death, or what it indicates the disease that caused the respondent's death, and it has a different response scale that's used in some of the other harmonized data sets, end of life data sets. As we saw before, variables have been built to account for any survey skip pattern, and each data set is accompanied by a harmonized codebook. So I hope I've given you just a brief introduction so you feel a little more comfortable if you weren't familiar with harmonized data. So let's jump into our analysis. So our first section is going to be kind of a cross-sectional analysis. And this is going to just use the harmonized share data. This is our most newly updated harmonized share, and this includes share wave 7, which was recently released. So our research question is going to be, are there country differences in disability prevalence, and are there age trends in disability prevalence? So the steps to do this, to answer this question, is we're going to first create the harmonized share data set. We're going to identify our relevant variables. We'll load the harmonized share data. We're going to create some additional variables. We're going to tell Stata, we're going to be using Stata for this analysis. We're going to tell Stata how our survey design is and what our weights are so that we can have better adjusted standard errors and account for survey design. Then we're going to estimate disability prevalence across age groups. And then we're going to estimate disability prevalence across age groups by country, so within each country. So we can see if we can see some time trends or some age trends, and if those age trends might be different in different countries. So to create the harmonized share data set, you're going to need to go to the Share Research Data Center and download their core waves 1 through 7. Their newest release is 7.0.0. You'll also need to download the longitudinal weights file and the all waves cover screen file. If you're wondering how to find that data, you could use the Gateway to Global Aging data. And in this top row of the Downloads tab, we have links to download survey data. So we could click here and we could look under our share column, and we can see that we can go to this center here, and we'll get to the share site. You can see here for user registration that user registration for share is free of charge worldwide. But you do have to register. So you have to register from share, and there's some information about how to do that. And then once you're approved, you can log in and download that data. And you want to save that data to your computer. And then from the Gateway to Global Aging data, you can download the Harmonized Share data creation code. So back on our downloads page, if you remember that in that last column, that last row, we can create harmonized data. So if we click here on Harmonized Share data code, we can download the Harmonized Share data creation code. And this is going to create a Harmonized Share version E, which was just updated. And again, we have some information about how to do that there. Once you have that data creation code, it's going to have all the code that you need to create the harmonized share on its own. What you will only need to do is edit the folder locations of the original share data in this data creation code. So here is this data creation code. Here's the very beginning of a very long file. And you can see here that we've asked you to define some folder locations, and that's in this section here. So in here, you would just write out where this data is stored on your computer. It could be anywhere on your own computer once you've already downloaded it from Share. I'll also mention we have these double pipes here. These are not supposed to be included in your folder location. It's just a folder location as you would normally write for any other programming language. Our next step will be to run the Harmonized Share Stata creation code in Stata. So you will just need to run this once. And this will actually take a little bit of time to run. I would say it's a minimum of 2 hours to run. Of course, Share now has 7 waves of data, and it's got a lot of individuals from a lot of different countries. And so this code is quite complicated, and it will take a while to run. The good news is that you only have to run this once ever. So once you run it, if you recall, we had an output location here. So wherever you specify in your output location, at the end of this program, you're going to have stored a Stata data set, which will be called H underscore share underscore E for version E. And you won't need to run that code again. You can just use that data set, as we will in this analysis. Also, from the Gateway to Global Aging data, you can download the Harmonized Share codebook. And let's briefly just look at that codebook, and we'll look at it some more later on. So you can see this is our Harmonized Share documentation. This documentation is built in with bookmarks, so you can see some information about what's included. You can see that we have sections on demographics, health, healthcare utilization, insurance, cognition, income, family structure. We could, for instance, go into one of these. We can see we have a variable here about number of children. If you click on that, we've got information about the variables that were created, about the number of living children. This is all in PDF. And then we also have some text about how that variable was created, if there were any cross-wave differences in share, and differences with the RAND-HRS. And in this analysis, we're not combining data from 2 different studies, but really harmonized data sets are made to be combined across different studies. That's the real advantage. So this analysis that we're going to do today, you could do almost exactly the same way using the harmonized HRS or the RAND-HRS data, or with the RAND-HRS data, or the harmonized ELSA for England, or harmonized Charles for China. There's a lot of different harmonized data, and you can find all of those on the Gateway to Global Aging data. So let's just close this for now and go back to our slides. So as I mentioned, SHARE has a lot of countries, and just for our sake of our analysis, we're not going to look at all of those countries. We're just going to look at 4 countries that were part of Wave 7 of SHARE. Now, Wave 7 of SHARE included 26 European countries and Israel. So for this analysis, we're just going to focus on Belgium, Spain, Czechia, or the Czech Republic, and Estonia. So you can see we've got some geographical variation inside of Europe. And you can also see here in this chart on the bottom left that Belgium and Spain were part of Wave 1 of SHARE, which started in about 2004. And they've been part of every wave. And they've also, you notice there's a gap here between Wave 2 and Wave 4. So at Wave 3, SHARE conducted a what they called SHARE Life, and that's a life history survey. So they didn't ask those regular repeated longitudinal questions. SHARE Life is also a great resource for anyone doing research, particularly research over the whole life course, not just of older adults. We also have some harmonized SHARE life history data file that you could use. And I think we have a webinar up about that also that you can find on our documentation page. And then you can see at Wave 2, the Czech Republic also joined SHARE. And then at Wave 4, Estonia became part of SHARE also. So one of the features of SHARE is that it's gotten larger. It's covered more countries the longer it's been in existence. So we're going to use these 4 countries for our analysis. And I mentioned we're going to be looking at differences in disability. So we need to identify how we're going to model disability. So SHARE includes a set of questions about difficulties with activities of daily living, or they're called ADLs. You can see there on the right what this question looks like. So the interviewer says to the respondent, please look at card 37, and please tell me if you have any difficulty with any of these activities because of a physical, mental, emotional, or memory problem, and exclude any difficulties you expect to last less than 3 months. And so you can see in card 7 here is actually a longer list here. But you can see 12 of these activities that include things like dressing, including putting on shoes and socks, using a map to figure out how to get around in a strange place, preparing a hot meal. And for our analysis, we're just going to focus on 5 of these. So we're going to consider dressing, walking across a room, bathing, eating, and getting in and out of bed, those first 5 on card 37. And these are really common ADL questions that are asked in almost all of the harmonized surveys. So we're going to focus on these 5s. And so we're going to say that for every one of these, if an individual has difficulty doing this, we would consider that kind of a proxy for some level of disability. So we're going to identify relevant variables in the harmonized SHARE data. So as I mentioned, we're going to use wave 7 of SHARE, and that was conducted between 2017 and 2018. And the variables we're going to want a respondent ID so that we can merge later on and keep track of who our individuals are. We're going to use a country identifier because, as I mentioned, we're going to look in differences in different countries. We'll also include an indicator of birth year, an indicator of the respondent's age at wave 7. Again, you can kind of see our intuitive variable naming convention here. So the respondent's age in years variable is R7 AGEY. We've already built, as part of the harmonized SHARE, an activity of daily living summary. That's called R7 ADLA. And we're also going to include a respondent analysis weight. So I will mention wave 7 of SHARE has kind of a specific and new design than some of the and than all of the other waves of SHARE. So as I mentioned, at wave 3 of SHARE, there was a life history survey that was given to everyone, and they didn't answer these kind of like core regular questions. At wave 7, to anyone who didn't answer that or wasn't part of SHARE at the time of wave 3, that SHARE Life survey, they were also given a survey of their life history. But in addition to that, they were given a kind of condensed version of the regular SHARE questions. So some things were included, some things weren't, to save on people's time. And in this case, one of the things you'll need to check is whether, if you're going to use, for instance, wave 7, whether those ADL questions were asked as part of that condensed survey at wave 7. And you can find that information using the Harmonized Codebook or by using the SHARE website. And in fact, they were. But let's say you want to figure out exactly how to find these. So one way is just to use the Harmonized Codebook as we saw before. So if I pull that back up, for instance, if we go into, let's just go into our demographics section, you can see here that we have person level analysis weights. That's going to tell us the name and information about all of the person level analysis weights. We can find that analysis weight that we want, which is this R7WTRESPC. You could also find information on age at interview. We have that in years and months. So you can find those variables that way. If you did want to look through the PDF, we've also built in a functionality into the Gateway to Global Aging data. So if you click on Surveys at a Glance, so you can search harmonized data by subtopics. So for instance, we can say, I know we want to use the harmonized SHARE. And in this case, we're interested in using that last wave, which we're calling kind of like 2017 there. And we know that we want a person identifier. And from demographics, we're going to want some birth date information and some age interview information. You can also see if you click here in health, they have an ADL, so we can click that and we can search for that. And what we're going to get is a list of variables that are part of the harmonized SHARE. So you can see there's our merge ID variable, there's our birth year variable, there's our age in years variable. If we go to the health section, we can also find there are ADL variables about dressing and walking. So you can find those that way, and it's quite simple to find them that way. You can see also how they're coded. So for instance, for ADL variables, 0 is a no and a 1 is a yes, and special missing values are included. All right, so then we can load our harmonized share data. So at this point in the webinar, we're going to start using Stata. You might have noticed that there is a handout for this presentation, and that's entitled Advanced Share Webinar October 2019 .doc. If you'd like to download that file, you can follow along, but you can certainly just watch my screen here. That DOC file is actually a DO or do file. That's a Stata program that you can look at. And we're going to use that Stata program. And one of the advantages of that program is that there are some pauses set in, so we can perform some operations and stop and then kind of see what's going on in our data set and then keep on going. So I'm going to be walking through inside of Stata with that do file as we go along, and you could also. So the first thing we're going to do is going to read in harmonized share observations and variables. So there are a lot of variables in the harmonized share data set in particular, because we've got 7 waves of data. As you saw in our code book, there's variables that are created on so many different topics. So often you don't want to pull in maybe the entire data set. Also, depending on your version of share, you might not be able to pull in at the same time the entire harmonized share data set. So we're going to pull in all our observations, but just for specific variables. And it's those variables that we listed before. So we're going to pull in merge ID, country, RAB year. We're going to pull in all of our age variables. This question mark here in our code acts as a wildcard, so it's going to pull in variables R1 through R7 of AGEY and our weighting variable we talked about. And then we can limit our observations to country of interest, so we can keep if those variables are in one of our 4 countries using that country variable. So let's actually switch over to Stata, and we can start our do file. I'm actually going to make that just a little bigger. Okay, so we load in our data. You can see here in the variable pane that we've got all those variables that we requested from the harmonized data. We could also tab country here, and you can see that we've got observations from Spain, Belgium, Czechia, and Estonia, and we have around 8,000 for each of those. So those are pretty nice sample sizes here. And again, those are observations for anyone who has responded to at least one wave of share is included right there in that data. In our next step, we're going to create some additional variables. So we're going to create an indicator of any ADL difficulty. So as I mentioned, we have kind of this summary variable, and you could look at the Harmonized Share codebook and find out more about that. But that summary variable, because we have 5 ADLs, it basically ranges from 0 to 5. So whether you have difficulty with none of the ADLs or all of the ADLs. And we're going to make a binary variable of whether you have difficulty with any of those ADLs. And we can do that using theegen function inside of Stata. And we can say cut, and what it's going to do inside of Stata is going to cut from 0 to 1, and then from anything that is above 1 to below 6. So from 2 to 5 in this case. So we're going to create that variable. And we're also going to create 5-year age groups. We're going to use the sameegen cut command inside of Stata. And in this case, we're going to be looking at 5-year age groups from people who are 55 to 94. So if we go back over to Stata, we can type that in. Let's look at those variables quickly. So we can tab our R7. Let's actually tab, let's cross tab R7, our original ADL variable, and our newly created grouping, which we've called R7 ADLA any. And here you can see what we wanted to do, so that anyone who had an ADL summary score of 0 now has a 0 for our binary, and anyone with an ADL summary score of 1 through 5 has a has a code of 1, meaning that they had at least one difficulty with at least one of those activities of daily living. We can also tab our age categories. So you can see we've got ages, in this case 55 through 94, and our sample sizes are kind of largest for people who are basically below 80, the group of 84 here, the group that's labeled 80. But we've got some nice sample sizes, even with just these 4 countries inside of SHARE. One of the helpful things about Stata is that you can tell Stata if you're using data that was based using a complex survey design, you can tell Stata how to analyze that data. And it's also helpful for multi-country analysis. So in this case, we're doing kind of a multi-country analysis. So we're not going to specify a cluster here. SHARE does provide strata and cluster variables that are country specific, but in this case, we're just going to account for the difference in our weights for different countries. And we're going to say SVY set. We're going to say our probability weight is that weight that we specified for wave 7. That's a respondent level, because we're going to be doing a respondent level analysis weight. And our strata here is just going to be country, which is going to tell Stata that our weights are specific to that country. If we do that inside of Stata, we could also use the SVY describe command. And you can see a little bit more about that, how that's set up. So you can see there we have our 4 strata for our 4 different countries and the number of observations that are contained in each. As I mentioned, there's more information both on the Gateway to Global Aging data and on the SHARE website if you want to specify more about the particular stratification and clustering that's used inside of a country. But for our kind of simple analysis, we're just going to be using this. So let's estimate some things now. So we've got our data loaded in. We've made some variables that we're going to use to create. We've told Stata how our survey design is set up and told it the weights we want to use. So let's estimate the proportion of the population with an ADL difficulty for each age group. And we're going to do that just for all 4 countries together at this point. One of the nice things about SHARE is that the weights basically take into account the size of each population. They're scaled that way. So a small country would have a smaller set of weights than a large country. So they can be combined in this way. So to estimate this proportion, we're going to use the proportion command in Stata. So we're going to estimate the proportion of people based on our binary variable of having any ADL difficulty. We're going to do that over our age groups. So that's the second half of that first command. The first half basically reminds Stata that we've already told it how our survey design is set up. That's that SVY. And in this case, we're going to specify our subpopulation, because of course, there's weights for people who are outside of the ages that we're considering inside of SHARE for this analysis. And so we're just going to tell Stata that we're only using a subset of those weights. For instance, in most countries, SHARE starts interviewing people at age 50 and older. So there are a lot of people who are younger who wouldn't be included in this analysis. SHARE also includes younger spouses, even who are married to an age-eligible person. And then, of course, it follows people to the end of life. So there are people who are 100 in the SHARE data and over. So let's do that first. Let's look at what we get there. So we'll look at this SHARE, this Stata output. So the first thing that you can see is that our number of observations here is 17,000 in our subpop there, 17,500. And what Stata has done is it's going to give you the proportion of people, or an estimate that's for people who have no ADLs or 1 ADL for our 5 age groups. So you can see here, so we're going to look at 2 because this is people who have an ADL. So for people who are 55 to 59, we would estimate that 5% of them would have any ADL difficulty. At the top end of the spectrum, we would estimate that people who were 90 to 94, that around 62% of them would have an ADL difficulty. And we can actually look at this graphically, which is sometimes nicer. So it looks like you can see like a real age trend that's happening from ages 55 in particular to 94, looking at these groups, where it starts out quite low and really seems to be low consistently throughout the 60s, and then starts to increase at age 70. And we can also test whether these are different, and we can do that using kind of a regression technique. So we can estimate the effect of being in each age group has on having an ADL difficulty. We can do this using a logit regression because we're estimating the effect on a binary variable. And in this case, we're going to specify, again, just our any ADL difficulty variable as the dependent variable, and our independent variable is just going to be our age groups. And we preface that with I dot, which tells Stata to treat each case as an independent one, and basically makes a set of binaries and does them. So let's run that inside of Stata. So it estimates our logistic regression. In this case, you can see that we have dropped our reference group here as people 55 to 59. And then we can look at our coefficient and our p-values to see which of these are statistically different and how are they different from that reference group. So you can see that there is no statistical significant difference between ages 60 and ages 60 to really 69 in this case, and our reference group of 55 to 59. And you can see that it does start at the 95% confidence to be different for the age group starting at 70, and then a 99% confidence difference for that age group, that 5-year age group starting at age 75. So we can kind of test some of those differences there. So we've seen those. We can also estimate, as I mentioned, we want to estimate disability prevalence across age groups and by country. So can we see different age trends in different countries? And this is really simple inside of Stata. Again, we've already told Stata how our survey design is set up. So the only change in this first command and our previous command is in that over category, we're going to add our indicator of country. So we're going to say over country and our age groups. And what that will do is we'll create independent groups that are basically kind of cross tabs, if you want to think about it like that, between those two groups. And we can see those. And then we can also test some estimates for whether specific country-specific age groups are different from each other. But first, let's go ahead and estimate that. So you can see here our Stata results are going to get quite a bit longer. But you can see here that we have estimates. We have 32 estimates, right? Because so we have 8 per country, and we have 4 countries. So we have estimates for Spain for ages 55 to 90, and similarly for Belgium, Czechia, and Estonia. And looking down at these, you can see we've got a long list of those. And let's just look at these graphically, because sometimes that is a little easier than reading the code. So here we see different age trends by country. Of course, one thing you'll note is that our standard errors here are a little larger, and they're particularly large in that oldest, maybe the oldest 2 age groups. Of course, you saw that we had less people in those age groups overall, and then it's going to be less because we're now looking by country. But it looks like you can still see some real within-country age trends happening. And those age trends do look like they have slightly different curves or slightly different relationships, which is quite interesting. And as I mentioned, we can test whether some of those are actually different from each other. So for instance, we can test whether the estimate for individuals 85 to 89 is different between those individuals in Spain and Belgium. And we can do that using a post-estimation test inside of Stata. And you can run that just by using this code here, which you would say test. And again, we're looking at people, the estimate of people who have a disability. So that's what's called prop 2 for 7 versus 15. Again, to understand what 7 versus 15 is, you just need to refer up to that Stata output after your estimation. So 7 is people in Spain, 85 to 89, and 15 is people in Belgium of the same age. So let's do that inside of Stata. So this first difference between people 85 to 89 in Spain and Belgium, we can see that they're not statistically significantly different. We can also test the estimate, for instance, for the difference between people in Belgium and Czechia. And that's going to be 2 versus 3 also. And we can see that that is that itself is also not statistically significantly different. That's group 15 versus 23. So let's move into our longitudinal portion of this analysis. And at this point, this is where we're going to bring in that harmonized share end-of-life data that I mentioned. So our question here is going to be, are there time trends in disability prevalence based on time until death? So before we kind of looked at age trends in a single year, and in this case, we're going to be looking at time points, so not specific to an individual year. This is going to be an individual time trend based on time until death. And are there different trends in different countries? So for our steps, we're going to create the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data set. We're going to identify our relevant variables. We're going to merge in the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data. We're going to pool observations across all waves, so we'll kind of reshape our data. We'll create a few additional variables. We're going to estimate trends in disability prevalence across time to death. And then we can estimate trends in disability prevalence across time to death by country. So could we see a different time trend in different countries? So to create the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data, it's going to be exactly the same basically way that we created the Harmonized SHARE data. So if you've already downloaded that data for the Harmonized SHARE, you won't need to download it. It's based on the same data. But you would need to download the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data creation code from the Gateway to Global Aging Data. And that is provided directly under the Harmonized SHARE data on the Downloads tab, again, of the Gateway to Global Aging Data. So you can see here we have the Harmonized SHARE data code and the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data code. So you would just download that. Similarly, you're going to edit the photo locations. That's the only change you have to make to this data code. Then you can run it inside of Stata. Once you run it, again, that Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data is stored on your computer. You won't ever have to run that again. And then from the Gateway to Global Aging Data, you can download the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life codebook. And that codebook will look very similar to the codebook we saw for the Harmonized SHARE data. So we're going to identify relevant variables, and you could do this again using the Harmonized SHARE codebook, Harmonized SHARE end-of-life codebook, or the Gateway to Global Aging Data as we did before. So we're going to need a respondent ID because we want to merge with the existing data that we have. We need a year of death variable because I mentioned we're going to be looking at time until death. We're going to be looking at and then this question of activities of daily living was also asked as part of the end-of-life interview to the next of kin or whoever was answering that interview for the respondent. And so that question asked, did the individual who passed away in the time leading up to death, did they have any difficulty with those activities? So we've got another report of that. So first we can merge in the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data. So merging in Stata, this is called a one-to-one merge because we have observations to individual level data sets. So there's going to be one person for one person, which are identified by merge ID using our Harmonized SHARE end-of-life version B data set. And we're going to keep those two variables, those variables of the count of ADLs and the death year. And then we can also limit our observations to our countries of interest with an end-of-life interview. So the Harmonized SHARE end-of-life data is going to have data from any country inside of SHARE which has conducted end-of-life interviews. But again, we're only going to be looking for this analysis at those 4 countries. And then, of course, there's lots of people in the Harmonized SHARE data who are still alive or who have passed away but didn't have an end-of-life interview. So we're really just going to keep people who have had an end-of-life interview merged with what they told us about themselves during their life. So let's go inside of Stata here. So you can see, so first we merge in this data. We have 4,300 matched cases. So we're just going to keep those matched cases. We can tab by our country variable here. So you can see that we have around 1,500 from Spain. So these are people who were part of SHARE and had an end-of-life interview. About 800 for Belgium, about 1,000 for Czechia, and about 1,000 for Estonia. So those are some decent sample sizes for this analysis here. So that's quite nice. And now we're going to pool observations across all waves. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to limit our data to only our variables being used. We've got some other variables inside of Stata right now that we used before. For instance, we've got our weighting variables that we're not going to use for this, and maybe some other variables that we also included that we're just not going to use at this point. So we're going to drop those. Currently, SHARE does not produce weights for the end-of-life files. So this longitudinal portion of the analysis is going to be unweighted. SHARE does provide longitudinal weights while a person is still alive in the main survey, and those weights are included in the Harmonized SHARE dataset. So for instance, if you wanted to look at changes between one wave or changes between waves 1 and 7 of SHARE, SHARE has provided weights for you to do that. But currently there's no weights for the exit data. So we're going to continue just unweighted for the time being. So we'll take our estimates with a slight grain of salt. But these samples are mostly nationally representative probability samples. All right, so first we'll drop some variables, as I mentioned before. And then we want to treat the end-of-life interviews as a separate observation. So basically, we're just going to rename that variable a little bit so that it has a variable name very similar to our wave-specific variable name. So that variable of RAX ADLA, and that's that summary count of our 5 ADL measures, we're going to call that R99. We're treating just the exit interview as wave 99, and we'll give that the same variable name. And we do that because then we're going to reshape the data into a long format. So as I mentioned, right now it's a wide format, and so we're going to reshape it into long, and we do that with the reshape command inside of Stata. And we're going to reshape our variables, and we have wave-specific variables for age and ADL. We also have some variables that aren't wave-specific, and those are things like our birth year and our year of death. So those we will leave as they are. The individual or the observation level is merge ID, and we're just going to make a new variable called wave. So once we've reshaped that into Stata, Stata gives us some brief information. We can also look at how our data looks. So let's list our data just like 1 through 21 observations, and we can set by merge ID, and we just won't look at any labels for the time being. So what you can see here now in our long data is that we've got multiple observations or records for an individual based on their wave. So for this first person here, they've got information about ADL from wave 1, wave 2, wave 4, wave 5, wave 6. They weren't part of wave 7, and we know that they had an exit interview. So that's what we've called wave 99. And we've got an ADL value for all of those. We've also got age values for any of those core waves. So So our data is now kind of pooled, so we can look across what's happening at a certain age for different individuals. And then we're going to prepare our variables just a little bit, just a couple of changes. So we're going to create a time until death variable. So we know the death year and we know the person's birth year, and we also have their age values. So the first thing we're going to create is we're going to create an age at death variable. We'll call that RADAGEY. So death in year, the age of death in years, and we'll make that variable by subtracting the death year from the birth year. And then we're going to create a variable called RD time, and that's going to be the time between their current age in that survey and their age at death. And so then we'll replace that variable with a value of 0 if it's that exit interview. So that's that question that's asked about to the time right before death, how many ADL difficulties did they have, that time leading up to death. And then we can look at that variable a little bit. One of the things, if we do this right now inside of Stata, so we'll go through, that we notice when we sum this variable is that there are a few, certainly not many, but there are a few negative values, which seems interesting. And so I think what that suggests is that there's some discrepancy between the year of their death as reported in the exit interview and their ages that they told us, or their birth year they told us during the interview. So we're going to exclude those cases where you can see that we just have 35 cases where that happens. But overall, that's not happening. You can see that for some people, we have up to 14 years going back. We can go back 14 years from the time of death in the SHARE survey. And those are probably people from our first countries that started at wave 1 of SHARE. We could also list our data here again. So you can see here that we've added 2 new variables. So we've got an age at death variable. So for this first person here, they died at age 88. The second person died at 81. Our third person died at 82. And then for those waves which they participated in, we've got the time until till death. So for this first person, we've got their first observation 12 years before death. And then we've got their exit interview, which we're calling 0 years to death. And you can see we'll have that for all of our individuals. So our data is set up quite nice for analysis. And since we're not using weights, we're just going to start to estimate some things. We don't have to tell Stata about our weighting here. So first, we're going to estimate the proportion of the population with an ADL difficulty for each time to death group. Oh, let's create those really quickly. Almost forgot about that. So we'll create an indicator of any ADL difficulty, again, just a binary like we did before. And then we'll create 2-year time groups. So let's look at that, RD time. So we have a variable here, which is going to group people into times. So times 0 to 1 years until death, 2 to 3 years until death. And this just is kind of helpful for providing these estimates because we don't have a huge sample size here, especially, you notice when we're getting down into, 8 years outside of time of death. Also for certain countries who joined later, wouldn't be possible to go 8 years back depending on the country. So it depends on how long that country has been part of that SHARE panel, whether you could include them. So we built that variable, and now we can estimate. So in this case, we're just going to say estimate the proportion of of this variable RADL any, so having any ADL difficulty over time. We can do that inside of Stata. As before, we're going to get an estimate for not having a difficulty and for having a difficulty. So you can see that for basically at the time of death or a year before the time of death, we estimate that around 60% or 61% of the people across our 4 age groups, across our 4 countries, would have an ADL difficulty. And 10 years back, we would estimate that 20% of those people would have an ADL difficulty. We can look at that graphically as we did before. So it does look like we see kind of a time trend happening where up until the time of death, we can see more disability kind of modeled as any ADL difficulty by the time of death. You'll also notice that our standard errors are kind of large, especially the further you go back in time. And they get, we have these are all people with at least what we're calling a zero observation. So that's people who were part of the X interview. So we've got a much narrower confidence interval for that 0 to 1 time group. And lastly, this is kind of our last step here, we're going to estimate trends in disability prevalence across time to death, but by country. So again, our command is going to look basically exactly the same as our previous one, but in that over option, we're going to specify country and RD time. So you can do that, and we're going to get, again, this longer output because we've divided up more groups. And if we just look at that graphically, you can see that it looks like we really do have some different time trends happening by country. So one thing first that you'll notice is that Estonia, and Estonia was that country that joined SHARE in Wave 4. So we don't have information about people who were in Estonia. We don't have observations of them for more than these 8 years that are defined here up until time of death. So we're missing those 2 later categories there for them. But we do have those categories for Spain, Belgium, and Czechia. Czechia, again, if you recall, they joined at Wave 2. So we, for our 2 earliest time points, again, our standard errors are fairly large there. But it looks like we can kind of, some patterns are suggested here. So for instance, in Spain, it looks like the kind of increasing proportion of people with an ADL difficulty over the time span, and then right at death, it jumps up quite high. In Belgium, it actually looks relatively flat until the time of death, and then it also jumps up. Czechia, kind of the trend in ages that's suggested there, to me looks a little more like Spain. And then Estonia looks to me maybe a little more like Belgium, where it looks relatively flat. You don't see quite as big of a trend. But of course, especially for Czechia and Estonia, our standard errors are a little large to suggest anything too important. And we can also kind of test these effects a little bit using Stata. So we can estimate the effect of time of death and being in a specific country on having an ADL difficulty. And again, we'll do that using a logistic model. So we'll tell Stata we're going to estimate a logit, where our dependent variable is our indicator of any ADL. And then we're going to specify an interaction term. And this is a full factorial interaction. That's what that pound or hash means in the middle. And we're going to interact a continuous variable. So we're not going to use our age categories here, but a continuous variable for RD time, that's time until death, and our categorical variable of country. And that full factorial variable is going to estimate main effects and the interaction effects. So if we do that inside of Stata, you can see first we get main effects for each country. In this case, Spain, our first country, is our reference group here. So you can see that adjusting for the differences in time to death and adjusting for the interaction effects, that we can see that the main effect per country is not statistically significantly different between Belgium and Spain, but it looks like it is different between Czechia and Estonia. We can see that controlling for country and the interaction of time and country, that as we would expect, that being closer to the time of death increases the probability or the likelihood that you'll have an ADL difficulty. And then we can look at these interaction effects, and these tell us something about that trend, what that trend looked like. And you can see with our reference group of the trend being the trend that we saw for Spain, we can see that the trend in Belgium is statistically significantly different. And it looks like it's not different from the trend in Czechia and Estonia, But then I think again, then we want to think about sample sizes a little bit more also. So that's going to wrap up our sample analysis. We hope that this webinar was helpful for you to understand a little bit more about harmonized data, how to create, in our case, the harmonized share and harmonized share end of life data, and just some information about getting access to where to find those variables, what variables to use, and how to structure those inside of Stata to do a kind of simple analysis. Of course, there's lots of variables. There's lots of more interesting questions you can use using the shared data or the harmonized shared data sets. And as I mentioned, the harmonized share is just one harmonized study that we produce data sets for using the Gateway to Global Aging data. You can also see that we have harmonized data sets for the US, Mexico, England, Costa Rica, Korea, Japan, Ireland, China, and India. If you have any questions about using the harmonized data or getting access to them, you can email us at our help desk. That's help@g2aging.org. There's a team of people who work on these data sets, and we'd love to be able to help you if you run into any troubles. And you can visit us at the Gateway to Global Aging Data at g2aging.org, where we'd ask you to register. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. I will take questions now for those people who have questions. I didn't have any questions pop up throughout the webinar. So if anyone would like to ask a question now, I'm happy to hang out here and ask questions for as long as people have them. Let's see. So we have one question from Kay. Kay says, I'm a doctoral student, doctor of PH. Harmonized End of Life data has two file versions, A and B. Is there a difference? End of Life data does not have a weight. Does weight need to apply in analysis after merging RAND and End of Life data for longitudinal analysis? So a couple of questions in there. So for the end of life data, yes, we're in the process of updating to version B of the harmonized share end of life data. Version B includes wave 7 of share. So it's just an update. It's not an update in terms of variables, but it includes more observations based on those new end of life interviews that were conducted as part of wave 7 of share. And that data code will be up shortly. And then you also asked the question, it sounds like maybe you're here referring to the HRS. So does a weight need to be applied in the analysis after merging RAND and end-of-life data for longitudinal analysis? So the RAND HRS is kind of one of the user-friendly files that's produced by the RAND Corporation, in this case, of the HRS data. That's the US study. We kind of use the RAND HRS as our model for comparison. So we have a harmonized HRS end-of-life data, which can be merged with the RAND HRS end-of-life data. So similarly to share, currently the HRS does not provide any weights. They don't provide weights for end-of-life data. There's a couple ways that you can still structure a meaningful analysis without having that weight provided. You could, for instance, develop your own weights, or you could use the weights that are provided as part of the regular core interview and account for mortality inside of those in a different way. And if you'd like any more follow-up, you could certainly email us here at the help desk. Also mentioned for the HRS has a great team of people who work on it, and they also have a help desk, which is on their website, and I'm trying to remember their help desk email. I think it's like help@HRS data. Let's see, help desk here on this handy HRS website. Yeah, it's hrsquestions@umich.edu. They also are super informative and helpful, and we'll get back to you quickly. Are there any other questions? Again, recording and the slides from today's webinar, as well as that the code we used for our sample analysis, will be put up online. within the next 24 hours on the Gateway to Global Aging Data, and that will be available from our documentation page here under recent presentations. Jing Wu asks, do end-of-life data have info about euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide? So I am not, Jing, I'm not sure off the top of my head whether they do or not. One thing to look for is you can use our surveys at a glance search by keyword. So for instance, we could search for euthanasia. So we can search for that by study. I think I'm going to spell that wrong though. Or we could search for the word suicide, although it's a little hard to know if they would use that word. So let's see, inside of ELSA, it's looks like these are about suicidal questions. And I'm not totally sure off the top of my head. You can look through all of our end-of-life, all the end-of-life data sets on our surveys at a glance tab to get a better idea. You can see we have this end-of-life interview tab. So you could look through them, through those questions and kind of get a sense if they ask it. I know that currently we don't have them included in the harmonized end-of-life data, but depending on the study, they could be asked. So I think that's just something you would have to kind of search for and think of different keywords, or look through the interview questions, the questionnaires themselves, to really get a sense of whether that's available. Preti asks, can the data be analyzed using SPSS? If yes, are there webinars planned around this topic? Thanks for that question, Preti. So in general, the harmonized share is actually kind of an exception as a data set that you have to create using Stata code. For most of the harmonized data sets, you download them as data files from that study. And in those cases, they're provided as SAS, Stata, and SPS formats. So for anyone who will allow, we provide all three as those data providers allow. In the case like the harmonized share, where you do have to have Stata to create it, we do have some information about what to do if you don't want to analyze the data inside of Stata. So you can see this here. We have this sentence: if you would prefer to work in a statistical package other than Stata, you can convert the harmonized share dataset using a program such as stat transfer. And then also SPSS has, I think, certain commands where they can read in, I can't remember if they can read in Stata datasets currently, but using stat transfer, you definitely can transfer a Stata dataset to an SPSS dataset. So you don't have to do your analysis inside of Stata, but you do have to use Stata at least once to create the harmonized share. We don't currently have any webinars planned using SPSS. It's interesting, it's helpful to know that that's a request you're making, and we can certainly think about that in the future. We try to gear our webinars towards what people have an interest in and we haven't covered before. So that's certainly something we'll keep in the future. If you have any specific questions about SPSS, you're welcome to email our help desk, and we could answer those questions. There are some people in our office who have experience with SPSS. Are there any other questions? All right, well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this webinar today. Thank you again for joining and staying around for the questions. I hope this has been informative and has made you excited to start to use some of these exciting resources that are provided by the gateway, such as Harmonized Data and Harmonized End of Life data. Thank you and have a great day.